Well, hello and welcome, everyone. We're going to talk a little bit today about, okay, I'm going to retake the California bar. What does that look like? And before we get started on the actual topic, retaking, I want to introduce myself and talk a little bit about who I am, and then we'll jump into the meat of our conversation. So my name is Jennifer Carr, and I have been doing bar prep and helping folks prepare for the bar exam for about 15 years, not about, exactly 15 years now. I'm licensed in California and Nevada. Took the Nevada bar exam first, and then about 10 years later, took the California bar, and have been coaching folks through the California bar ever since, and moved over to BarMax just about 6 months ago. So a little more than 6 months, I guess, maybe 7 months. So lots of experience helping folks prepare for the bar exam, and lots of experience helping folks prepare to retake the California bar exam. So with that being said, I'm going to share some substantive information today about okay, I've got this score and what do I do with it? What does it mean? And should that inform how I study next time? Does it not inform how I study next time? What do I do next? And I also want to kind of just share a little bit about how to get in the right headspace to be successful preparing to take the bar exam a second time. And then I'll also just talk a little bit at the end about BarMax and some of what we offer. So with that said, let me go here and share my screen. Okay, share screen. Okay, so oops, there we go. Right. Okay, I don't think that was sharing with you all, so.
I could see it.
Oh, good. Okay. There we go. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about the bar exam and okay, I'm about to, I'm going to retake the bar exam. What does that look like? And the first thing I want to talk a little bit about is why did we decide to do this now, right? So bar exam results were released, 10 days ago? And the idea is we want to give you a couple of minutes to kind of adjust to, hey, these are the results that I got. And how do I feel about that? Because you are going to have some feelings, and that's totally normal. It's to be expected. If you didn't have emotions around, what does it mean to take the bar exam and to be in the position of retaking the bar exam, and what is that like? Then you wouldn't be a human being, right? And you have to be step number one to taking the bar exam is you've got to be a human being. So we want to give you some time to process that. And then today we're going to talk more about okay, so what do we do with this information? What's the next steps in our game plan? What does it look like to plan for success in light of, having had this experience this most recent time? Okay. So I'm going to tell you two stories, one of which is about Thomas Edison, and then I'm also going to tell you a story about my kids, which seems like just a way to get a chance to talk about my adorable children that I'm so proud of. And don't get me wrong, it is, but there's also a point. So let me start with Thomas Edison. So Thomas Edison is, obviously this famous inventor. And what we probably remember him for the most is all of the different things he invented, like the phonograph, the light bulb, all of these different, I mean, he by the time he died, he had something like almost 1,100 patents, 1,093 patents. So just this incredibly prolific, talented, brilliant inventor. And for those of you who are science buffs or science history buffs, and you're like, what about Nikola Tesla? Yes, there was some controversy about, which of these things he was directly responsible for. He later on gets involved in some litigation around what did he invent. But the moral of our story is this is a guy who, by the time that he, was finishing up his career, inarguably was successful by any measure, right? Whether we're looking at sort of financially, in his home life and his professional life, but it didn't start out that way, right? So first off, he had to overcome some pretty significant obstacles to achieving that success. So he caught scarlet fever as a kid and was completely deaf in one ear and very hard of hearing in the other ear. Modern medical historians who look at his life suggest that he might have had ADHD, sort of known for being particularly scatterbrained and not really sleeping very much, working odd hours, being disorganized, and like the person that can bring like this brilliant creativity to the problem, but not necessarily the best at like step-by-step solving it. And he had to learn to do that, right? And so, he had this moment in his life where he's like, I believe that I can invent this light bulb, but nothing I've tried has worked. And so he actually says at one point, I haven't failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work. And I love that idea, right? That like, okay, this isn't about failure. This is about collecting data. This is about figuring out, hey, the cardboard filament doesn't work. I have no idea why he thought that like putting cardboard in the light bulb to transmit the electricity was gonna work, but like that was a thing he tried and it didn't work. And then he had that data point and he could say, all right, let's cross that off our list of things to try. So that's my first story, is about this famous inventor who, at one point in his life, probably would have been seen as being not particularly successful, right? As someone who had tried all of these different ways to create this light bulb, and then just wasn't able to bring that to fruition right away, right? And had to regroup. And so what he did was he said to himself, this is data. This is information. This is something that I can use to inform my work as an inventor. And so separately and apart from, sort of being famous for being an inventor, he's also famous for bringing the idea of the scientific method to inventing, right? So up until this point, people would invent things in the sense of like, hey, I had this great idea, and they would, make it happen. But they didn't really have like, hey, I had this great idea and I tried this thing and I kept detailed notes and it didn't work. So then I tried this other thing and I kept detailed notes and that didn't work. So then I tried a third thing. They didn't really do that, right? Like you sort of filed your patent when you had something the idea of like, publishing your data or describing your method for achieving an invention just really wasn't that common at this time. So he's really the guy who does that, who says, look, if you're going to, being an inventor, being a mechanical engineer, an electrical engineer, a sound engineer, being the person who brings these ideas into fruition, we got to keep notes and we got to keep track of what's worked and what hasn't. So that's my first story. Now, my second story about my adorable children. So I have two kids who are both in what used to be called Boy Scouts, but is now just called Scouts. And my son is just finishing up his first class, and my daughter's just finishing up her second class. And so for those of you who are not familiar, basically the idea with Scouts is they're going to give you these different activities or lessons that you have to sort of learn and pass in order to move on to the next level. So, for example, they have to do a certain number of service hours. They have to learn how to tie certain knots or go on a certain number of hikes or camp out for a certain number of days or we're all lawyers to be or lawyers in here. And so they have to learn about, U.S. government. They have to talk about being a citizen in the world community. So like they have all these tasks that they have to do. So one that's been on hold pretty much since, the last 14 or 15 months is their swimming test. So in order to move past your second class, you have to be able to swim 25 feet, turn around and swim 25 feet back. To do your first class, you have to swim 75 feet, turn around, swim 75 feet back, and you have to do it using certain strokes. And like, we have not done any kind of swim. We don't have a pool or anything, right? So like we would have had to have gone to a community pool, but we're in California. And so everything's been shut down because of COVID. And so, they did a Zoom meeting about the swimming, like and like, here's your book, but they didn't have the opportunity to actually try, right? They didn't have an opportunity to practice. And so we were looking at summer camps for them because, hey, by the way, we're in California, it's been COVID, everybody's been home all the time and they have to get out of the house so that I can like do grown-up things like work. So we're trying to get them situated in terms of getting them, to scout camp. And the question is, what level are they? So the troop says, we're going to do a swim test. And so they get their books, they get their swimming trunks, we drive way the heck out to the swimming test place, and they get in the pool, and both of them fail the test. And, obviously they were super excited to go and do the swimming with their friends. It was embarrassing because, all their troop mates are there and it seems like everybody else can do it. And why can't they? And of course, afterwards, people who are well-meaning, but, don't really know exactly what to say, are calling and texting them, hey, we're sorry that didn't work, blah, blah, blah. And this is a little bit analogous to, the bar exam. Obviously, like your 11-year-old swimming test, maybe not exactly the same thing, but this sense of like something that you've worked really hard for and you're excited to do, and you've done your best to prepare, and then you aren't able to achieve it, and it sort of does dictate what they can do in their swim camp, right? Like swim camp, scout camp. They can't do certain things because they haven't passed this test yet. And so this sense of like something they've really been looking forward to that's been put on hold. And so again, a lot of feelings, and, we left, and they were very sad, and we went home and just, had some ice cream and talked about, this is hard, but also this is data, right? Like this, bring it back to Thomas Edison here, right? This is data. This tells us that y'all like talking about this in your Zoom meeting and reading your scout book is not adequate preparation. And so if we want you to, we have choices to make. If you want to go to scout camp, then we're going to have to figure out a way for you to do more swimming. And if you want to go to scout camp and do the swimming classes there, you can, and we know what level you're going to be at because you didn't pass your test, right? And so similarly, what I hoped to convey to them and what I want to convey to you all too, is that it's okay to have those feelings, and it's okay to feel like everybody else passed and I didn't. And this really stinks. And I've been looking forward to this for however long. And it's this one silly test that I know I could do. And I just didn't achieve what I wanted to, and to have those emotions. But eat your ice cream, talk to your mom, respond to your well-meaning friends and family. And then I want you to start thinking about this as data. This is data that we can use to plan your next attack so that you can be successful the next time around. And I just wanted to let you know, I did ask them before I shared that story, I did ask them, would you be comfortable with me talking about it? And they both said yes. They've been around me talking about bar exam prep for long enough. They're like, yeah, we know that sometimes you're not always successful on your first attempt, but that's not failing. That's just finding ways that don't work. So I really like this idea, like Thomas Edison, I love his perspective of, look, I'm not going to accept this label of failure. I'm going to redefine what failure means. And I'm going to say that, I could look at this as 10,000 separate individual failures, or I could look at it as part of this ongoing test that I'm doing in my effort to find what does work, right? And so I would encourage you to think about your bar exam journey in the same way. So, you have this one attempt, you didn't get the result you might have wanted, but if you think about it as one step or one way to kind of ascertain what does or does not work for you, this is valuable data that you didn't have before. And I also want to emphasize to you that you actually have some advantages as retakers that our first-time takers don't have. So I would say, I've listed a couple here, but, of course, there's a ton of different things that you would bring there. But one that stands out to me is going to be perspective. So our retakers, you kind of know what it's like to go through this, right? And there's actually been some research on test anxiety. And one thing that we know about test anxiety is that people who are anxious tend to do what's called catastrophizing. And so this is where you get anxious. And so everything seems like a much bigger deal than it really is, right? And so instead of it being like, hey, I'm going to, I didn't pass my swimming test. And so I guess, one of the things I'm going to do at scout camp is practice swimming, or I guess I'm going to have to give up some afternoons to go do the swimming lessons, or I guess my Auntie Heather is going to have to let me come over and swim in her swimming pool. I didn't pass my swimming test, and that means I'm not a very good scout. And that means that everybody else is a good scout, and I'm the only one who isn't, right? And all of a sudden we take it kind of out of proportion. And so having been through that, and I'm not saying that like this is rational, and of course it's not rational. The definition of feelings is that it's not rational, but a lot of first-time takers can have this feeling that like, oh my gosh, I'm not going to be successful. And so, then what's going to happen? My life is just going to be over. But as retakers, we know that's not true, right? Your family still loves you. You're still, going to be a lawyer. All of these things are still available to you. And you can bring to it a different perspective than you had before. First-time takers, a lot of them will say to me like, gosh, I haven't even thought about civil procedure since my first year, 3 or 4 years ago. Retakers are like, yeah, I looked at this, last time I sat for the bar, right? Like you've got that foundation. You might need to brush up on your, the finer points, the exceptions to the exceptions to the exception, but you have the foundation there. And so that means that instead of spending time kind of just building that base, you can get to the part where you're adding in the stained glass windows and the carved doors and all that. Similarly, most retakers come to the exam with a greater base in their skills, right? So maybe you really needed to practice your essay writing. And as a retaker, you've had the opportunity to do some essay writing practice. And so because you've done that essay writing practice already, you bring that greater depth of skill, ability that, a first-time taker may not necessarily have. And the last thing that I would say retakers bring is self-understanding. You have a better sense of what does and does not work for you. And if you take nothing else away from today's session, I want you to walk away with the surety that you have a better sense of what will and will not work for you than you had before this experience. Okay. So first-time takers, they're getting advice from, their bar prep company. They're getting advice from professors at school. They're getting advice from their friends. They're getting advice from the place where they're going to work after they get a job, after they pass the bar and get a job, hopefully. They're getting advice from their landlord's cousin's attorney from 3 divorces ago, right? Tons of advice. And they tend to be super like, okay, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that and I'm going to do something else. And they don't know what works for them. This is your opportunity to say, okay, what works for me and how do I want to spend my own valuable time and effort and energy and to bring that to there. Oh, so I guess this is saying it's not sharing, or my screen is not sharing. Can you guys see
It shows approaching the California bar as a retaker. That's the only screen.
Because that blocks it.
No, I don't think so.
That was asked if that helps.
Let me.
There. Now we have the other slides.
Okay. I thought there was
I see the Thomas Edison quote.
Okay. How about now?
Yeah, the Thomas Edison quote is up now.
Okay. And now does it say redefining failure? No.
Does it?
No, you have not moved on to the next slide. You're on the Thomas Edison slide.
So I think I don't know, we're just going to do it this way. Okay. So, okay. Speaking about redefining success. So I can't figure out how to do this where it just shows you the one slide, but that's okay. We're going to look at this. So, slides that you haven't seen apparently, super brief recap of Thomas Edison and his life, cute little picture of the light bulb and the like, hey, I'm not failing. I just have found 10,000 ways that didn't work. And then the 4 things that I would say retakers bring to the table that first-time takers don't necessarily have. So I mentioned a minute ago, one of the things that Thomas Edison is famous for is for bringing sort of the scientific method to inventing. And that at the time that he was doing a lot of his work, the idea that you would keep sort of detailed notes about what you tried and didn't try, and maybe share that with other folks and try to like develop a systematic way to invent things was not really common. And so he's credited with bringing that to his inventing, his process of inventing. And so I argue that we can do something similar with the bar exam. We can use these same techniques of, kind of observing what happened, asking ourselves, why did that happen? Developing some thoughts about how we might change what we did in order to be successful the next time around, and then practice and gauge whether or not we were successful based on what we tried. Okay. So I'll start with some really basic information about just like, what does my score mean? Because I get that question fairly often. I will say, having coached folks through different bar exams, I do think the California discussion of scoring is actually one of the best that there is. So poke around on the California Bar website. You'll see that they do a really great discussion of how they grade and score the exam. And they also do a really good discussion of scaling and what is scaling. Super briefly, and not a statistician, but basically the idea is that because the MBE is given nationwide and it's given every year, it's what we would call a standardized test, meaning it should be the same amount of difficulty from year to year. And so we're going to take everybody's individual we're going to take individual essays and we're going to pair them to the MBE score to try to make sure that the essay questions themselves are also the same amount of difficulty. So that, it's not like, hey, the exam that I took in 2015 is way easier than the exam that y'all had to take. Or, that the exam that, your boss took in, 2010 is so much easier or more difficult than that. So hopefully it's making it the same amount of difficulty. So much more detailed, like specific mathy kind of advice or information on the State Bar website about scaling. I'm just going to talk about the scoring. So you used to have to get a 1440. So you'll still hear people talk about the 1440. That number has changed. It's now a 1390. You have to get a 1390 in order to pass the California bar exam. And that score is divided where it is half of that 1390 is going to come from the written portion and half of the 1390 is going to come from the multiple choice portion. Or you could say that they're equally weighted, right? Then the written portion is further divided or further allocated so that you've got these 5 essays in the PT, and the PT is worth twice what an individual essay would be. So you get these raw scores, and then those scores are scaled, right, using the magic of math, to sort of match it up to the MBE, so they're hopefully about the same amount of difficulty. The other thing that California will do as you're looking at your score sheet is they will tell you, this was where you were percentile-wise in relationship to other applicants on the MBE nationally and in California and on specific subjects. So if you see like a 90 under evidence, then you were better, that you were at least as good as or better than 90% of the people who took the MBE this time around for evidence, right? So that's what all those different numbers mean. You have that raw written score for each individual written answer, which is then added up and then multiplied by a factor. It was like, I don't know, like 3 point something, depending on the year, to sort of match it up to the MBE through scaling to try to make it the same amount of difficulty. And ideally what you want is that, both your written and your MBE score are going to be as close to 1390 as possible or above that, right? You can make up for it a little bit. Like if you find out like, hey, I'm actually really, really good at the MBE, and you're getting, a 1440 on the MBE, you can go, you can get a 1370 on your written answer and it'll average out. But trying to get as close to 1390 or above for both portions if you can. So step number one is going to be really looking at that score sheet and how did I do? And then I want you to start asking yourself some questions like, how did I do on the written portion? How did I do on the MBE portion? How did I do on that in relationship to each other? So if you see that like, hey, I really did not do very well on the written portion, that is valuable information. Don't judge yourself. Don't criticize yourself. Don't, get into this cycle of, because you can get into a shame cycle, right? Of like, oh, I didn't do as well on that as I wanted to. Why didn't I do as well as that as I wanted to? What do I do next? Don't do that. Let's just, at this point, all we're doing is observing. We're just like, okay, what happened and why did it happen? And what are we going to do next? So look at your written portion, look at your MBE portion. How did you do? Were there certain subjects that you did really well on? Like, did you get, an 80 on a contracts essay question, and then you were also in the 90th percentile on contracts? That's valuable information. That tells us on exam day, under test conditions, you killed it on the contracts part. Might need to work on some other things, but we know we've got that one in the bag. I also want you to look at the PT. So I said earlier, if you walk away with nothing besides, I just am going to, use this as an opportunity to gather some data, that would be perfect. Second most important thing to walk away with is don't underestimate the PT. Written portion is worth half. PT is worth 2 essays. It's one place where you can make a really quick, easy improvement in your overall score. So don't underestimate that PT. Consider it in relationship with your other essay questions. It is part of your overall writing. But because it doesn't require knowledge, it's a pretty good test of just like, how's your writing, right? Do you need to work on your writing? And it can be deceptively difficult, right? Particularly if you're already practicing, it's supposed to be a practice test, right? A performance test. It's practical. But it is not, we still have to use IRAC. We still have to convey this knowledge back to the examiners in the way that they're going to reward us for conveying it. Okay, so one question here that I'm going to just answer now is, what is the passing score for the MBE? That's a really good question. Virginia, thank you for asking that. So I would say, at a minimum, in my ideal world, you're getting at least a 1390, or if you were taking this in another state, we might say a 139. But, if you were a little bit above or a little bit below that, that would be okay. It's not like you have to hit 139 or you fail. If you get, a 138 on your MBE, but a 1410 on your written, that averages out to a 1390, you're fine. So the short answer is I want you to be as close to a 1390 as you can be. Fritz, I will answer your question in a bit, so hang on to that one. Okay, next things to look at. And when people ask me, like, why do people fail? Like, what causes someone to fail the bar exam? I would say, is this somebody that was able to prepare, right? And sometimes, I would say it's really a question of like, did they have an adequate time to prepare, right? Certainly there are people who I'm going to go to Tahiti for a vacation for 3 weeks before the bar exam. I've heard of that, right? I haven't met anybody who's actually done that, but I've heard that that's a thing. But far more likely is that you've got people who, look, you're balancing work and study and prep and being a human being and family obligations and community obligations. And there's a freaking pandemic going on in the world, okay, that's good information though, right? Because that says, okay, maybe what we have to change is figuring out how to get you time so you can be successful. Then I'll see folks who prepared, they put in the time, but they didn't really do it in a way that resulted in success. So maybe there's some other ways that they could prepare that would allow them to be successful this time around. And then the last thing that happens is going to be people who have some sort of anxiety, right? Or something happens on exam day that trips them up. And I would say for most folks, it's anxiety. I will say I've had a couple of folks who've come to me and said, no, it's actually more about like, you know, having to do this remotely and like managing like the exam soft and all of this stuff. And it's challenging. So either didn't have time to prepare, didn't prepare in a way that's going to get them the reward that they want, or they did all that preparation and they weren't able to express it because of their anxiety or other problems. So here's some potential scenarios for you. Maybe you did really well on the MBE. So you heard me say, like, I need you to get at least a 1390 on your MBE, and you're looking at that score sheet and it's a 1450 and you're like, look at me. But hey, I didn't pass because my written answers were not good, right? I wasn't even close to that 1390. That tells me you need more time writing. So as we gather this information and we develop a hypothesis and we decide what we're going to do next. So if your MBE is good, but your essay writing is lower, that tells me you need more time writing. Sometimes it's the other way around, right? You have somebody who actually did pretty well on the essay part, but struggled with the MBE. That means you're going to need more practice doing the multiple choice questions. Sometimes you have people who they do pretty well on the MBE, and they also do pretty well on the MBE topics, but they just got hammered on PR and, you know, this most recent time around, community property, those state topics. So this is somebody who probably has spent a good bit of time studying the MBE topics, which is wise, okay, but maybe didn't spend enough time on the state-specific topics. We know what we need to change next time around, spend some more time on the state-specific topics. But here's something else we know. We know that this person, whatever they did for their MBE topics worked. So we need to carry that over with into the state-specific topics as well, right? So your study methods were successful for the things you studied. Let's get you more study on other topics as well. And then you have folks who just like all around didn't go the way they wanted it to. Sometimes that puts them back in you know, the category of like they just didn't have time to prepare, or they didn't prepare correctly, right? They only studied, they didn't do any practice, or they only practiced, they didn't do any study. Or maybe they've got a learning disability, or they've got some anxiety, or something else is going on that impacted their ability, separate and apart from like their actual throughout the prep period prep. So let's say that you're in that camp, you're looking at your score sheet and you're like, Jen, that's me. I'm the person that needs to learn more law. Like I acknowledge it. Like I just wasn't able to concentrate the way that I wanted to. What do I do next time around? So the first thing I'm going to say is I want you to schedule carefully. And we've actually got, there's some webinars that you can watch over on the YouTube channel. For those of you who are BarMax customers already, their office hours are also available, where we'll, you know, you can get and you know, not just advice from us, but I'm sure other people be happy to give you advice. But obviously, I'm going to say our advice is good. Don't be afraid to like take a look at some of those video lectures and say, you know, hey, what works for me, right? If you were the person who killed it on contracts, you might not need as much time with contracts this time around. You still need probably some time, don't ignore it, but you might not need like all the time. So don't be afraid to kind of individualize. Think about what you know and what you don't know. The other piece of advice I will give you is I want you to focus on what is difficult for you. And in this context, I'm talking about subject-wise, right? So if you know that, hey, contracts is really easy for me, and I really struggle with property. Sometimes the temptation is I'm going to spend some extra time with contracts because I'm good at that. And I know if I just spend a few more minutes on it, I can really nail that one. Versus like property, it's hard. I don't know if I can get it. And so sometimes there's this inclination to spend more time with like what is easy rather than what is difficult, right? Like, because it feels more manageable. But in terms of, time wise, you can generally get a bigger return on your investment of time if you focus on what is difficult for you rather than what is easy for you. I also want you to think about how you want to spend your time budget. So sometimes folks will say, I really like your flashcards, but I don't know if I want to do them because it seems like it takes me a long time to go through all the flashcards. Here's the thing. If they're useful for you, that is a valuable, way to spend your time. If you are the person where you're like, hey, actually listening to the lectures, like I can repeat back everything I hear, maybe that's more valuable for you. So don't necessarily think about, I don't want to spend too much time on any one thing. Instead, think of where can I invest my time where I'm going to get the biggest return on that investment, right? There's very little that you're going to do for bar prep that's going to be like wrong, right? If you were like, hey, I'm preparing for the bar by watching Law and Order and eating chocolate, that might be wrong. But, whether you're listening to lectures or reading the outline or using our flashcards or making your own flashcards or practicing, like all of those are good and valuable things. But think about like, where am I going to get the biggest return for my investment? And I'll talk a little bit about what we generally would expect to see sort of across a general audience in just a minute. Let's say that you're looking at it and you're like, look, I know pretty well, that I'm good at doing these MBE questions, but man, writing is really hard for me. Or you're the other way around. You're like, writing is pretty good for me, but doing the MBE questions, I'm just like not doing as well as I want to. Number one thing I want you to do is practice. You've got to practice the skill. And a lot of times folks will say, well, before I can write an essay, I need to really understand such and such topic. No, you don't. Like, just get started writing right away. Or, before I can do an MBE question, I have to know everything there is to know about future interests. No. Practice now. And I used the example of essays here, but you can do this with MBE questions too. Like, do some MBE questions. How did you do? Like, that gives you a good sense of where you are right now. Study a bit. Do what Celeste has called the open book practice method or the open book study method. And remember, the goal here is learning sort of how to do the bar exam as much or even more than like what's on the bar exam. So yes, you have to know contracts. You kind of have to know like what the rules are and like what's tested. But even more than that, you have to know, okay, this is what's tested and here's how the examiners ask those questions. And so focusing on doing questions, doing real questions, right, that are actually used by the National Conference of Bar Examiners, super, super important to getting a sense of this is what is likely to be on my bar exam. Or maybe you're the person who was just like super anxious. And so I'll tell you the story, which is sometimes credited to Abraham Lincoln, but basically, you've got someone who goes out and gets a job chopping wood, and he's the first day he's like the fastest guy chopping the wood, and everybody's super happy, good job, whatever. Next day he's like, hey, still doing okay, not great, but okay. Third day he's super slow, and what's going on here? What, you were super fast the first day, but now you're kind of slowing down. And the guy says, well, I think it's because your axe is kind of dull. And the woodcutter says, well, I don't have time to stop and sharpen my axe. I have to keep cutting wood because I'm so far behind. So if you're someone who struggles with bar exam anxiety, or you have learning disability or something like that, make sure that you're taking care of yourself. Make sure you're sharpening your axe. It doesn't really do you, good to say like, yeah, I'm super anxious and I could go for a run or do 10 minutes of meditation or write in my journal or whatever it is that you do to stay calm and sort of manage it. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to sit here and be super anxious and not be able to concentrate for an hour. Like take the 10 minutes and do what you need to do. Have some anxiety is a good thing, right? Like it's kind of that punch of adrenaline that like gets you going and you do what you need to do. Too much anxiety can be paralyzing. And you can have that, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, right? So if you're the person who's like, I have to know everything before I can practice, you might be falling into that category. But make kind of managing yourself and like how you're gonna achieve this output part of your bar prep. Make it part of what you do to be successful. So we've got a question. Okay, so one question is, how much, so Sue says, basically, what would your raw MBE score need to be in order to get a scaled score of 1390? So it's going to vary from year to year, and it's not exact. But a really rough estimate would be to say you could subtract like 120 to 150 points. So to get a 1390, you need to be at like a, I don't know, like a 129, which would be a 1290 raw. So Virginia says, I don't understand the answer to your question. Is 1091 in the MBE pass or fail just for the MBE session? So and I think part of the challenge is that you have to look at it holistically, where it's they're not really considered separately. But here's what I will say. With a 1091 in the MBE, you're going to have to get a really, really high essay score in order to pass, right? Because you have to average out to a 1390. So you're like 300 points away from where you would want to be. So I would say MBE is definitely someplace where you want to invest some time and energy to bring that score up. And Mario, I'll answer your question about handwriting versus typing in just a second. Okay, so hopefully as you were listening to that, you were like, oh, I have a hypothesis. I'm the person that needs to practice more. Or I'm the person that needs to spend more time with the state-specific topics or whatever it is. So what do I do next, Jen? So now let's put that hypothesis to the test. And I just want you to practice. And if I was going to give you one tip for how to be successful on the bar exam, it would be to practice. And like I said, I think so many of us get in this headspace where it's like, we know like that there's all of this stuff that we should know about contracts that we don't know. And so how am I going to write this answer if I don't know this information? And the answer is, you just got to get practicing, man. You got to do it, because you could keep chasing, the finer details of contracts for the rest of your life and not feel ready to get started. You have to get started, and sort of keeping in perspective that it's not just what's on the bar exam, but how what is on the bar exam is tested. So when you're practicing, here's what you're doing. If you've said to yourself, like, Jen, I have to spend more time with the law, like I just didn't have what I needed to have in terms of knowledge to be successful, I need you to practice so we know whether or not what you're doing now is working. If you have said, I need to do more practice with writing, I need you to keep practicing with the writing so we know whether or not that's resulting in an improvement. This is also a way for you to learn what you don't know, okay? So a lot of folks will say, I just need to learn everything, but that's probably not true. So, if I asked you what is negligence, you could probably tell me, well, it's like duty, breach, causation, damages. I don't need you to look at that again. But I do need you to, do some negligence questions and discover that, hey, I don't know what the duty of a general practitioner doctor versus a specialist is. I need to learn more about that piece. So one of the things you're doing as you're doing these practice questions, whether they're essay questions or MBE questions, is you're learning what you don't know. And that is helping to guide your study time and the time that you're dedicating to your preparation. You also want to learn what is tested. So you want to know, like, what is, how does this stuff come up? So if I'm going to write your criminal law question, I can do it right now. Some people are going to agree to do something. It's going to be a felony. And during the course of it, someone is going to die. That pretty much every question looks that way. If it's crimes, right? Crim Pro, police are going to have someone, and maybe they're in custody, maybe they're not, and they're going to ask some questions that might or might not be an interrogation. So once you've looked at enough of those questions, you begin to get a sense of, like, this is what they ask in this topic. So you're practicing not just to get a sense of what you know and, like, whether your study methods are working, but also to get a sense of, like, what do they ask and how do they ask it. The other thing is, practice is actually a really good way to learn. So if you think about, my kids trying to learn how to pass this swimming test using their scout book and a meeting on Zoom with their scout troop, like, not super helpful, right? Like, there's a reason that there's, all these stories about parents who, like, just throw their kids into the swimming pool and, like, sink or swim or whatever, right? Because, hey, practice is one of the ways that we learn. And it's the same thing with the bar exam. We don't just test you so that we can see whether or not you have learned. We test you as a way to learn. And for those of you who might be struggling with anxiety, practice tests are a way to kind of desensitize to that anxiety. It's also a really good way to kind of know what does and doesn't work for you. So if you're someone who's struggling with a disability, and you want to know, like, what does it look like to do this under these conditions, practice tests are the way to go. It's how you're going to get there. And then the final step in our scientific method is to look at, okay, we came up with a hypothesis. I need to study the state-specific topics in more depth. We've tested that. Here's me studying those topics and then practicing, doing some essay questions. And then we're going to look at, like, did it work, right? Like, how's it going? And kind of to adjust as you go, right? Don't get so wedded to a specific idea that, I really thought I needed to study state-specific topics, and now I'm doing really well on those essays and not so well on the MBE topics, but I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing rather than adjust, on the fly either, right? Like, you have to do both. You're going to kind of evaluate as you go. And I don't want you to be afraid to ask for help. So again, I'm going to talk about my adorable children, but my son, who's 14 and probably doesn't want to be called adorable, is going to an arts high school next year. And they sent out this newsletter. And this was one of the drawings that was included, one of the children had done or whatever. And I really, really loved it. And so the text says, "What is the bravest thing you've ever said?" asked the boy. "Help," said the horse. I love that, right? So I don't want you to be afraid to ask for help. And this is where I'm going to talk a little bit about BarMax and, like, what do we offer and all of those things. We're here if you need help. So if you're listening to me talk about, don't be afraid to individualize, and you're like, I don't know how to do that. Like, what, I don't know what I need to focus on. Don't be afraid to schedule a tutoring hour. If you're hearing me say, practice, 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 and you're like, I am going to submit every single essay I have, and then maybe some more too. You can buy additional essays. Like, we're here and we want to help. And so these are some different testimonials that you can see. You can also see them on our website. You can also, wherever you buy apps, you can see kind of how the apps are rated and how our program has been rated in the App Store. You can also check on places like Trustpilot. They'll tell you like, this is how it's people have experienced doing using BarMax. These are the different courses that we offer. Obviously, you guys are going to look at California. But I want to talk about the tutoring because that's something that we've talked about specifically today. And so you can get 5 hours of tutoring, and maybe what you need is somebody to help you look at your schedule. You want to write a couple of essays and go about your merry way, and then come back sort of towards the end of the prep period and say, actually, will you sit down with me and like look at what I'm doing now and make sure I'm on the right track? All the way up to, I want 50 hours of private tutoring. Like I want to meet 3 times a week or 4 times a week. I want to, hit this thing hard and knock it out of the park. That's available to you. So I don't want you to, all of this stuff is available. Feel free to poke around on the website and see kind of what you think. And we're here. We want to help you. We're also happy to answer questions, just like if you just have like a quick content question, we're happy to answer those kinds of things. And speaking about answering questions, let me see what else is in here. So Pat says, what would be the MBE score to pass only with the MBE in California? I'm asking because it's 50% of the total exam. So I think maybe, Pat, you're thinking of the attorney's exam. So if you are an attorney who's licensed in another state, you can take the California a portion of the exam. So just the essays and the PT, and that will make up your entire score. So still going to be aiming for somewhere between, like a 65 raw score on those essays. And then they're still going to be scaled, and you're going to need to clear a 1390 on that written portion to pass. For the rest of us who are still doing the MBE portion, you want to be aiming for a 1390 on both the written portion and the MBE portion. But you want to remember that there's some wiggle room. So if you get, a 1380 on the MBE, but a 1400 on your written portion, that averages out to a 1390, you still pass. Okay, so Fritz Trent says, I took the exam over 40 years ago. Everything appears to be different. Should I approach the exam as a first timer? I love that question. And yes, everything is different. It's very different from how it used to be. Even just in the past, let's say 10 years, it's changed significantly. I think here's what I would say. So you still have the knowledge that you had from the last time that you did it. And that would hopefully help with things like anxiety or kind of just the fear of the unknown that can sometimes happen. But your strategy will probably necessarily be different, and that's okay. So I do think it's in that aspect, it is like thinking about it like a first timer. If you've been practicing, you may find that there are certain areas like, I do transactional work. And so I'm super used to drafting contracts or reviewing contracts. Maybe you don't need to spend as much time with that. And so you're essentially a second time taker for contracts. But you may still essentially be a first time taker for your wills and trusts portion or whatever it might be. So I would say, you still have probably a knowledge base that you have from last time around. You probably still have some of the benefits of sort of anxiety reduction. And so in those ways, you're like a second timer. But in terms of kind of having it be recent enough ago that kind of what, this is what the PT portion is going to be like, probably not. So in that way, you're more like a first time taker. So I know that was kind of like it's a little bit of both, but that's really kind of the truth of the matter. Mario says, I'm a slow typer and I'm a terrible handwriter. What approach would you suggest? I love that question, Mario. That's such a good question. So I will tell you that the question years ago used to be, should I handwrite or should I type? And the New York bar exam did a study comparing the scores of handwriters versus typers and found that they were essentially the same. Now, that was years ago, but still, that's the data that we have. I think what I would do, Mario, would be to, well, okay. So the first thing that I would say, what I'm seeing in both of your options here is like, you're not at the speed that you want to be at. The more you practice, the better you'll be. So just keep working with that. If you are concerned about time, and most people are, one of the things you really want to make sure that you're doing is prioritizing. You want to make sure that, you know, if you're doing an essay question and you have to leave off some issues, you're doing that on purpose. You've looked at all those issues, you've identified everything, and you've said, these are the things that are most important. This is what I have to talk about in order to be successful. And those are the things that you're getting in. I have seen, you know, the representative good answers up on the website that are a page and a half typewritten, right? They can be pretty short, but you have to make sure that you're planning really, really well in order to do that. So I would say the first step in your approach is practice both, kind of get a sense of which you prefer and which you're more comfortable with. And then the second step in your approach is getting really good at planning your answer before you type or write. Stephen says, do you recommend memorizing now or waiting until the BarMax calendar says to start learning black letter law? So I love this question too, Stephen. So, and what I like about this question is, well, okay, so let me say this. You know, even though it doesn't feel like you're memorizing, if you're writing an essay and you look at you're like, oh gosh, I'm pretty sure this is about conflicts. And then you go and you look in the outline, you're like, oh yeah, it is conflicts. And you write your rule down. You're beginning that process of memorization. You're beginning that process of learning that law, right? So even though you're not necessarily like, you know, rote memorizing, the open book method is still, and there's actually data that says this is the way that like people tend to learn best anyways, right? You're going to learn best when you have to use the information immediately rather than like trying to just like memorize the information to use later on. Now, that being said, as one of the things that you can bring to the table as a repeat taker is you probably have a decent sense about what you know and don't know. So if you come across something and you're like, I do not remember this at all, then that's a way that you can individualize that calendar and say, I'm going to start, you know, wrestling with this information now rather than waiting to memorize until later, because I know this is something I struggle with, right? Versus, hey, this is something I basically know. I'm supposed to be at the reading it to understand it stage. I do understand it. I'm going to work to memorize it in more depth later on. And as a repeat taker, you have a sense of that our first-time takers may not have. Besides the open book method, what are some other methods that help individuals improve their score on the MBE? Oh, such a terrific question. Gosh. So the answer to that is folks who are struggling with the MBE tend to struggle with a couple of different things. And so I will say we do have a couple of really terrific webinars that Celeste actually put together on some of the MBE topics that kind of talk through both the strategy of answering the MBE, but then also like some of the information that you need. So for a more in-depth answer, definitely check those out. But here's what I would say. Number one, if somebody comes to me and says, I'm struggling with the MBE questions, I want to know, like, have they memorized the rules, right? Because here's the thing, dying declaration, a statement made under fear of impending death about the cause of impending death, and the declarant is now unavailable. your like knowledge has to be that in depth. Like you have to be down to not just like that it's a statement about the cause of death, but that also you're fearing that you're going to die and you're unavailable. And then you also have to know what it means to be unavailable, right? Like you don't have to die. You could be in a coma. You could have forgotten. You could be more than 100 miles away. And so you have to be down to that like really granular level. So that would be the first thing I would say is make sure you've got your knowledge queued up to where it's like, hey, you know, the exception to the exception to the exception. Number two, you have to do enough questions. And one of the things I love about BarMax is we're going to use released questions. So these are not, it's not like, you know, we hired somebody to look at released questions and try to write similar questions that are kind of like it, but like they're our own take on it. No, these are actual released questions. And the more of these you do, the more you get a sense of how these examiners ask the questions. And so just doing a bunch of questions can be really helpful. Although I also want you to bring a level of intentionality to that. So that if you see like, hey, I missed this question because who the heck has ever heard of burglary by agent? Is that even a thing? Okay, put that on your list of things you don't know that you're going to work on memorizing. That's a data point for you. And then the third thing that I would say would be being active as you answer the question. And for a lot of folks, trying to IRAC the question and identify the issue. And if you have to look up the rule right now, that's totally fine. Then, doing your own analysis and coming to your conclusion. And then and only then looking at those answer choices. There we go. Because you have to remember that, those answer choices are actually designed to be a little bit distracting. That's what they're called. They're called distractors. And so you don't want to look at those until you know what the answer choice is. Otherwise, you have that moment of, oh, larceny by trick. Boy, I didn't think about larceny by trick. What is larceny by trick? Let me reread this question and see if I should have thought about that. And all of a sudden, you're like gone off on a sidetrack, right? So think about improving your score by, number one, making sure you have sort of some in-depth knowledge of the law. Number two, doing enough released questions, real questions that you get a sense of how this law is tested. And last, being really active as you do it. So you're basically like trying to come to your own conclusion before you look at their answer choices. So Evelyn says, if somebody scores 150 questions right out of 200 questions, is that a pass mark on the MBE portion? That's another really good question. Lots of good questions here. So the answer is that would be amazing. So if you got 150 questions right out of 200, that would translate to like roughly a 1600 answer, right? So you're sort of aiming for 1390, you'd have 1600. That's amazing. In general, national average is going to be somewhere between 61 and 63% correct. California tends to be a little bit higher, more towards that 63 mark. So, like 126 correct raw, maybe a little bit more than that. I would say as you're preparing, aim to be a little bit higher than, that 63%, because, we got to figure that on exam day, you're going to have that sort of crunch, and maybe you're going to have a little bit of attrition in terms of where you were before. But, hey, if you're getting 65, 67% correct, you're doing really well. So, so 150 would be amazing. Really, if you got 130 correct, that would be terrific. Tamara says, do you have any indication when California will go back to in-person testing? So I have no inside information. I'm not like, I don't have, it's not like they're like, hey, Jen, we're going to go back to in-person testing. But I would say, it seems like lots and lots of things are opening up. We're all getting our COVID shots. I would be surprised if it wasn't back to in-person testing by February. I will say there's a number of states that are going back to in-person testing. Conversely, there are plenty of states that are still like, no, we're doing remote testing. The National Conference of Bar Examiners website does keep a running list of which states are doing which. So if you're curious about other states, you can look there. Otherwise, if you're you're just like, what's going on in California, I would keep an eye on it. My gut sense, completely with no special secret inside information, would be, I can't imagine that we wouldn't be back to in-person testing by February. Okay. So Anonymous says, can you do a score review even if you aren't signed up for the tutoring? And I'm going to let Katie or Celeste take that one.
Yes, we can. Oh, I'm sorry. I wasn't muted that whole time. You've probably been listening to my keyboard. How about that? I don't think I yelled at my dog. That's good. So yes, hi, this is Celeste, and we can review your score report. If you have you can't log into the BarMax, but if you have the BarMax app, or if you email Katie, which would be help@testmaxprep.com, I think, send that score report and we can look at it. We can give you that 10-15 minute little, we'll give it the overview and give you our quick advice to help you interpret that. Just honestly, very quick. If you are a BarMax student, you can also send your essays and we will have you meet with a tutor. We can give you a discounted tutoring hour. Anyway, just reach out to us if you, especially if you were unsuccessful in your exam while using BarMax. We do want to offer you, an extra deal, extra help, but we really recommend that you at least buy an hour to meet with a tutor and go over those essays and come up with a game plan for your upcoming exam. Because yes, we'll take a quick look at your score report. We want to help you. I mean, obviously we want everybody to buy BarMax, so we help our own students a little more, but we'll help you too, just so that you know what direction to go. Okay, we'll give it a quick look and explain to you what it means.
Yeah, and so we've certainly done that, like had people reach out to us and we've just said like, hey, this is roughly what this means, just like in a quick sort of written format. But as Celeste mentioned, the discounted hour. And if you've used us for tutoring or you worked with us previously, like we want you to be successful, right? Like you don't redo the bar twice a year, every year after you've taken it already, because you don't want to help people be successful on the bar. Like it's, like I said, I actually really love helping folks prepare for the bar. Like it's like that final hurdle, and then you get over it and you see people go off and be successful and like achieve their dreams. Right. That to me feels just like really wonderful. So we're always happy to take a look and help with that. Virginia says, is a 60 or a 65 a pass score on the California essay? So we generally tell you we want you to aim for a 65. For those of you who are like, wait, how does that work? So remember, you're going to have a raw score, and then all those raw scores are going to be added up, and then they're going to be multiplied by a multiplier, a number that is provided by Dr. Polis, who's the statistician for the California bar exam, that scales it / matches it to the MBE portion. So that's the long answer. The short answer is, go ahead.
I'm sorry. When you're done, I have one more thing. Finish the statistics, please.
Okay. So the short answer, though, is we want you to aim for a 65. Now, that isn't to say that you couldn't have a question at a 60 and a bunch of others at a 65 and still pass. That isn't to say you couldn't have a 55 for one of your questions and get a 75 and still pass, right? So remember that it is going to be added up. There's lots of chances to make up lost points, but as sort of a mark to aim for, we want you to aim for a 65. Okay, so I don't see any other questions in the Q&A. I'll just peek over at chat here. Oh, and so Celeste in the chat explains where to find the different office hours and the webinars. There's a question in here. How do I practice for the California distinctions? 100% take a look at the California essays. Okay, so when we talk about practicing, make sure you're practicing the MBE portion, which is going to be sort of the general federal majority rule, but also make sure you're looking at the essays, which do test California distinctions. Paul says, how many issues should one spot on an essay? It's going to depend on the essay. Some essays are really sort of what I would call sometimes they're called a racehorse question, or they're called an issue spotter question, where there's just like a bunch, maybe there's 10. Evidence would be a great example of that, right? Where you might have, 5 or 6 statements that you're being asked to analyze, and each of those statements has a couple different things to look at. Others, like con law, might really just have one issue or a couple of issues that you're really delving into in an in-depth, sort of multifaceted way. So I think more what I hear in that question is, how do I get better at issue spotting? So that's going to be making sure you look at a bunch of different questions and really get a sense of like, how is this stuff asked? And then it's also making sure that you're comfortable with the material too, so that you can kind of see like, oh, well, they're mentioning that this is, a panel on a city bus because they want you to talk about government action or whatever. So for issue spotting, it's knowledge, and then it's knowledge of how the law is tested. So Brunette had said, how do you suggest improving for issue spotting? Specifically, if you know the law, but you're not applying it correctly, how do you get better at that? So as I said, part of it is going to be just like knowing the law. So if you know the law, good job. Half of that's out of the way. And then the second half is going to be, if you're not applying it correctly, that's going to be knowledge of how the law is tested, right? And so for those of you who are like, well, how do I know if I'm applying it correctly? If you're doing that con law question and it's like, hey, the city government is going to put up, bus panels that encourage folks to, I don't know, do whatever. And you check the answer and you're like, oh, this is about speech. I get it. That's a situation where you're not applying it correctly, or where you're not seeing it, even though you know the rule. In that instance, what I would suggest is that you make a chart where on the left-hand side, you give your facts, and on your right-hand side, you give your issue. So you might have, the facts being something like, city government takes out bulletin board, and then the issue is going to be government-sponsored speech, something like that. And then you'll start to see like there's similarities, right? So, oh, this time it's not the city government taking out a bus panel, it's the city government putting up a bulletin board in the Main Street or something like that. And then you're like, okay, this is similar. And you start to see those patterns. But so number 1, knowledge of the law. Number 2, knowledge of how the law is tested. What is the email address again to send the score sheet? So I think you can use either the info@testmaxprep.com or you can use help@testmaxprep.com.
Katie, is it info? I think info is better at test. Let me write that down.
It's on my, it should be on this, hopefully, God willing, and the creek doesn't rise. The slide that you have in front of you has the correct email address, but I know earlier we mentioned the help@testmaxprep.com. So I think you could use either, but this was the one that I had. And then how much, so Susan says, how much is it for 1 hour of tutoring for a BarMax student?
Just reach out to us. Yeah. Just click support link. It depends on your circumstance, but there's a higher discount that's available to some students. Yeah.
And
reach
then
out to us. We want to help you.
Yeah. Yeah, we want to help you. So we're available. Okay. Yes. And the answer is this, the info@testmaxprep is good. Okay. So I'm happy to just keep hanging out and answering questions. But I'm also happy to thank you guys for being here and being willing to, ask for help and get some advice, and really look at this from the perspective of like, hey, it's data and how do I get better at what I'm doing? So I'm, like I said, we're here if you want to ask us questions, but you can also head out if you've got other things to do.
thank you all so much for attending. I know I've been the disembodied voice today and a little confused, but Jennifer's material, as always, has been very helpful. And thank you, Jennifer.
Oh, Joe says, is there a calendar of events for the greatest hits?
No, but it will appear in the app soon. Like that, you know, where you look in the office hours, they'll show as upcoming office hours. And I will tell you the first two. The first one will be next Wednesday. Isn't that right, Jen? That is you and our instructor, Whitney. We're going to get some of our other instructors into the game now. So next Wednesday, May 26th, we'll have greatest hits in criminal law, search, seizure, and the murder sandwich at noon on Pacific time. That's for BarMax students. And then on June 2nd, we have Matthias, BarMax student instructor Matthias, at 1:30 Pacific time, teaching greatest hits in evidence. So those two are on Wednesdays. There's a couple that are Mondays or Saturdays just to accommodate certain teaching schedules, but for the most part, they're Wednesdays.
And office hours are available for students through the app, and then webinars are available on the YouTube. So you'll be able to see them there if you want, like if you're like, oh, I'm not available on, you know, Wednesdays at 3 or whatever.
Yeah, June 2nd, the Wednesday. Sorry. PowerPoint's not shared. The webinar will be available both in app and on the YouTube page. All right, good job, Jen. I guess it's time to get going. People reach out to us. We're here.
Yes.
Do this.
And Evelyn says, I'm going to look for a con law question about the city bus panel. I'm like, it's there. There's a California question just like that from maybe 2 years ago, 3 years ago, something like that. Okay. Well, thanks, everyone. We'll talk with you again soon.